Turin, winter of 1889. A man walks through the narrow streets of the Italian city, bent under the weight of an existence that no one else can bear to witness. His eyes, once burning, penetrating now, reflect something between despair and a disturbing lucidity. He talks to himself. He laughs to himself. He cries to himself. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche, and in a few days, his mind will shatter like glass against the concrete of reality. Grab your whiskey as we delve deeper into the subject. What drove Nietzsche to madness? If you've made it this far, it's no coincidence. There's something in you that recognizes the darkness, so subscribe to this channel, not for me, but because you know you need this kind of conversation, the kind that unsettles you, the kind that keeps you awake at night. Nietzsche once wrote, "Whoever fights with monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. So answer me this, what happens when you spend your whole life staring into the abyss and it finally stares back at you?" Before we can understand the collapse, we need to understand who this man was. Not the Nietzsche of memes, motivational quotes, or philosophy professors. The Nietzsche Ryoda, man of flesh, bone, and pain. In 1889, he was 44 years old. He was a brilliant, revolutionary, incendiary philosopher, and completely ignored. His works were rejected. His books didn't sell. The Academy despised him. Wagner, his former idol, had become his greatest enemy. Salome, the woman he loved, had publicly humiliated him. His sister Elizabeth manipulated him. His friends abandoned him. He was deeply, painfully alone. And yet, in that agonizing solitude, he wrote, "Thus spoke Zarath, beyond good and evil, genealogy of morals works that would change the course of Western philosophy." But nobody cared. Nobody understood. Nobody, have you ever felt that? That feeling of shouting your truths into the void and hearing only the echo of your own voice. Now imagine living that way for years, for decades, until your mind can't take it anymore. Nietzsche was not a philosopher who stayed in his study, had lived this philosophy. He preached overcoming adversity, the will to power, amor fati, love of fate, even when fate is cruel. But here is the devastating irony. While he wrote about vital force, about the Bermensch, about saying yes to life in all its brutality, his own body was disintegrating, migraines that left him blind for days, incessant nausea, chronic insomnia, pain so intense that he even wished for death. And he always wrote as if words were the only thing keeping him alive. But there was something more, something that the doctors of the time couldn't diagnose, something that modern science still debates. What was corroding Nietzsche's mind? Was it loneliness? Was it physical pain? Was it intellectual rejection? Or was it something far darker, a silent, invisible illness that was already there, waiting for the right moment to consume everything? Because, you see, Nietzsche didn't suddenly go mad. Madness didn't strike like a bolt of lightning one afternoon. It crept in slowly, like water seeping through the cracks in a wall. The signs were there. They always had been. And nobody noticed, or worse, nobody wanted to understand. Because it's easier to ignore the suffering of a misunderstood genius than to face the uncomfortable truth that perhaps, just perhaps, we too carry our own cracks, our own existential headaches, our own ability. So take a deep breath. Because what comes next is not just the story of a man who went mad. It's the story of how genius and madness dance together until one devours the other. And in the end, you'll wonder, where does the philosopher end and the madman begin? Or perhaps this distinction never existed. Let's talk about pain. Not that philosophical, metaphorical, poetic pain. No, let's talk about pain. The pain that wakes you at 3 a.m. The pain that makes you vomit. The pain that transforms light into blades and sounds into hammer blows to the skull. Friedrich Nietzsche knew this pain intimately. It was his most faithful companion, more present than any friend, more constant than any lover. Since the age of 20, he had suffered from brutal migraines, not those common headaches you can fix with ibuprofen. They were a devastating crisis which left him prostrate for days, sometimes weeks. He described the sensation as if his brain were being squeezed by an invisible walrus. And along with the migraines came uncontrollable nausea, violent vomiting, extreme sensitivity to light and sound. He needed to lock himself in completely dark rooms in absolute silence, waiting for the pain to pass. But it never completely went away. It only receded temporarily, like a beast waiting for its next attack. Now tell me, how do you philosophize when your own head is a battlefield? But Nietzsche didn't stop. He wrote in the dark, sometimes literally blinded by crazy. He dictated texts when he couldn't hold the pen. His eyesight was deteriorating rapidly. There are accounts that he needed to put his face just inches from the paper to be able to see his own words. And yet, he produced works of sharp philosophical clarity, thoughts that spanned centuries, ideas that dismantled millennia of Western morality. Irony is cruel, isn't it? The philosopher of vitality, yes strength, yes will to power, was being destroyed by his own body. It's almost as if the universe is playing a very bad joke. Nietzsche preached, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." But what was happening to him was exactly the opposite. Each crisis weakened him a little more. Each pain gnawed at him from the inside. And do you know what he did? He was taking drugs, lots of drugs. I'm not talking about recreational use. I'm talking about pharmacological despair, opium, hydrated chloral, potassium bromide, quinine, anything that promised some relief. Nietzsche self-medicated with a dangerous and chaotic combination of substances that, ironically, probably worsened his condition. The doctors of the time understood nothing. They diagnosed nervousness, male hysteria, excessive intellectual work. They prescribed leeches, ice baths, absurd diets. Nothing worked. And Nietzsche continued writing. He continued thinking. He continued finding God, morality, and society as a whole while his brain slowly disintegrated. Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. Can you imagine generating your best ideas while feeling like your head is going to explode? Can you imagine questioning all of human existence while barely being able to exist yourself? But something more disturbing was happening. Something beyond physical pain. Nietzsche began to have visual hallucinations, flashes of light, distorted shapes, geometric patterns dancing in his field of vision. Some modern experts believe he suffered from migraine, a specific type that causes visual and neurological disturbances. And here's the part that makes you think, could some of his philosophical views have been influenced by these hallucinations? When Zarathustra speaks of visions, revelations, and truths that appear like lightning bolts, was Nietzsche literally selling what things did a sick mind produce? I'm not saying your philosophy is invalid, far from it. I'm saying something much more interesting. What if Nietzsche's genius stemmed precisely from this intersection between lucidity and madness? What if your most revolutionary ideas were forged in the furnace of a brain that was simultaneously glowing and burning? Because, you see, it's no coincidence that his last years of philosophical productivity between 1883 and 1888 were also the years of his greatest physical and mental deterioration. Thus spoke Zarathustra's masterpiece. The Book of Humanity was written in altered states of consciousness. He himself described the process as if the ideas possessed, as if he were merely a conduit for something greater, something beyond himself. Behold, the man in his last book before his collapse is a megalomaniacal, prophetic, almost delusional text. He proclaims himself the greatest philosopher in history. He says his ideas will divide humanity into before and after him. And you know what's scary? He was, right? But at that moment, nobody believed him. Everyone thought he was just a man going crazy, and perhaps it was both at the same time. So here's the burning question. When exactly did Nietzsche begin to go mad? Was it in Turin in 1889? Was it years before? Or has it always been this way and we simply call madness what we cannot understand? Because perhaps the real madness isn't losing your mind. Perhaps it is to see the truth so clearly that no one else can keep up. And when you reach that point, when you cross the veil and see what's on the other side, how do you go back? How do you live among people who are still asleep when you've awakened to something that cannot be unseen? Breathe, because we're only just beginning to descend. There is a common kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from spending a weekend alone, from having dinner alone, from having no one to talk to. And then there is the loneliness of Nietzsche. The loneliness of being so profoundly misunderstood that even when you're surrounded by people, you remain utterly alone. The loneliness of shouting truths that no one wants to hear. The loneliness of being called crazy precisely when you're most lucid. This was the loneliness that consumed Nietzsche. And perhaps, in the end, it was this more than any illness that truly destroyed him. Let's go back a bit. 1882. Nietzsche is in love. What's her name? Lusalomia, brilliant, intellectual, free woman. Nietzsche sees her as his philosophical soulmate. He dreams of a shared life of thought and creation. He proposes marriage, not just one, but twice. She refuses, both times, and it doesn't stop there. Lou becomes involved with Paul Rie, a close friend of Nietzsche. The three form a strange, tense intellectual triangle, fraught with unrequited desires and unspoken resentments. There's even a famous photo. Lou holding a whip, Nietzsche and Rie crouching like animals pulling a cart, an image that Nietzsche would later call the greatest humiliation of my life, because it wasn't just romantic rejection. It was existential rejection. Lou didn't just say no to Nietzsche the man. She said no to his world, his ideas, his vision of the future, and that breaks a man, especially a man who was already cracked. But Lou Salome was just one piece in the puzzle of abandonment. Let's talk about Richard Wagner. Wagner was not just a composer for Nietzsche. He was a spiritual father, a mentor, an idol. Nietzsche venerated him with an almost religious devotion. He spent years in the Wagner household, absorbing the art, the philosophy, the Wagnerian grandeur, and then betrayal. Wagner converted to Christianity. He embraced exactly everything Nietzsche despised: herd morality, Christian humility, the denial of life in favor of an imaginary heaven. For Nietzsche, this wasn't. He broke with Wagner in a brutal, public, and philosophical way. He wrote The Wagner Case, a devastating attack on the old master. But here's the grim truth. Beneath the philosophical critique lay something far more human. Penned the pain of being abandoned by the person you admired most. And you know how it is, don't you? When someone you considered essential simply, I stopped seeing UAS if you never existed. Then came academia. Nietzsche was a professor at the University of Basel. Young, promising, brilliant, but his ideas were too radical. His lectures too provocative. His thinking too dangerous. He resigned or was forced to resign, depending on who tells the story. And after that, he never returned to the academic world. That was rejected, ignored, forgotten. His books didn't sell. Literally. Thus Spoke Zarathustra had to be published at Nietzsche's own expense because no publisher wanted it. Of the few copies printed, most remained unsold. Imagine, you create what you consider your masterpiece. You pour your soul, your blood, your deepest visions into it. And nobody reads, nobody buys it, nobody copies. How does this not drive you crazy? And then there was his sister, Elizabeth, the manipulator, the opportunist, the one who, after his death, would distort his works, edit them, adapt them to serve Nazis and precisely what Nietzsche would have hated most. But in life, she was simply toxic, controlling. She pushed people away from Nietzsche, interfered in his friendships, isolated him even further. And Nietzsche, in his desperation for some form of human connection, accepted because what's worse? Having a toxic person around or having no one around. Have you ever been so lonely that you would accept any company, even if it slowly poisoned you? So here's the reality. Between 1882 and 1889, Nietzsche lived in near total isolation. He wandered through Europe, Switzerland, Italy, Nice, Turin, always alone, always in cheap boarding houses, always with his pain, his migraines, his books, and his obsessive writing. He had no close friends, he had no lovers, he had no functional family, he had no intellectual recognition. I only haught himself, and gradually, even that began to disappear. Because here's the thing about prolonged solitude, it doesn't make you stronger. It makes you corrodes like acid, like rust, like water, wearing away stone. You start talking to yourself. And Nietzsche did, You begin to lose track of who is real and who exists only in your head. You start creating alternative realities where you are understood, admired, loved. And when you come back to reality and realize that none of this is true, something breaks. Nietzsche wrote for posterity. He said, "I am not for now. I am for later," as if the future were to compensate for the present. And he was right. The future glorified him. But the present destroyed him. So answer me this. How long can you stand being ignored before you start doubting your own sanity? How long can you scream into the void before you start hearing voices answering? How long can you endure absolute loneliness before you choose anything, even matters just to avoid being alone? Nietzsche resisted for years, but in January 1889, in Turin, something finally gave way. And what came next was a collapse that would change everything. January 3rd, 1889. Piazza Carlo Alberto, Turin. It's a cold morning. The sky is heavy, gray, as if the atmosphere itself sensed what was about to happen. Nietzsche walks through the square. He's been there for months, staying in a modest guest. He likes Turin. He says it's the only city that understands him. Of course, the city has no idea who he is. But that doesn't matter anymore. Nietzsche is used to not being seen. And then a coachman is beating his horse. The animal is exhausted, lying on the ground, trembling. The man hits it again and again. The horse doesn't move. It just suffers. Nietzsche stops. He observes. Something within him breaks. He runs to the horse. He hugs the animal's neck. He cries. He sobs. He whispers something inaudible and then collapses. This is the moment. The dividing line between Nietzsche the philosopher and Nietzsche the madman. He is taken back to the boarding house by the landlord. He is incoherent, alternating between convulsive crying and hysterical laughter. He speaks nonsense, shouts names, sings, dances, and plays the piano frantically or pretends to play, because there is no piano in the room. In the following days, he writes letters. Letters from madness. One of them is addressed to the King of Italy. Another to Cosima Wagner, wife of Richard Wagner. Another to his friend Jacob Burke, and he doesn't sign them as Friedrich Nietzsche. He signs Asianicus Earth Crucified when sometimes both, sometimes neither. One of the letters says, "I'm having all the anti-Semites shot. Other. I have just ordered the Pope's arrest." Another one, "I am all the names in history." Jacob Burckhardt, a respected historian, receives his letter. He reads it. He is alarmed. He immediately contacts Franz Overbeck, one of Nietzsche's last remaining friends. Overbeck travels to Turin. He finds Nietzsche in a catatonic state. He's sitting his gaze vacant, humming non-existent melodies. When he recognizes Overbeck, he embraces him and cries, "Friend, you came." And then, seconds later, he no longer recognizes him. Overbeck takes him back to Switzerland. Nietzsche is admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Basel. Later in the diagnosis, progressive paralysis is a 19th century medical euphemism for saying, we don't know what's wrong with him. But he's finished. Nietzsche the philosopher who defied God, who proclaimed the death of God, who constructed entire systems of thought. I was mentally dead. But let's go back to that horse. Because that scene, Nietzsche embracing the beaten horse, almost too romantic to be real. And perhaps there are no confirmed direct witnesses. The story has been retold, romanticized, reinterpreted. It became a symbol. It became a metaphor. But here's the thing. Does it matter if it's true? Because even if it's a legend, it captures something essential about who Nietzsche was at that moment. A man who saw suffering not conceptual, not philosophical, vitriol, raw, immediate, and he couldn't bear it. The philosopher who preached strength, harshness, amorphity, crumbled in the face of compassion. Isn't that ironic? Isn't that profoundly, devastatingly human? Why, think about this. Nietzsche spent years writing about the cruelty of existence, about how suffering is inevitable, about how we must embrace it, overcome it, transform it into power. And in the end, it was the sight of an animal suffering that broke him. Perhaps because on that horse, Heu saw beaten down by life, exhausted, fallen, no strength left to go on. Perhaps that hug wasn't out of compassion for the horse. Perhaps it was compassion for oneself to compassion. He never allowed himself to feel the weakness he always condemned. And when you spend your whole life suppressing something, eventually explode. In the following months, Nietzsche oscillated between moments of lucidity and total delirium. Sometimes I recognized where I was. I'd ask for paper to write on, but the words would come out jumbled, meaningless. At other times, he proclaimed himself emperor or God or Christ or all of them at once. He sang, he danced, he laughed for no reason, he cried for no reason. The doctors didn't know what to do. They tried treatments, cold baths, isolation, sedative drugs. Nothing worked. Or rather, nothing mattered, because Nietzsche was no longer there. His body continued breathing. His heart continued beating, but the mind, the fiery, revolutionary, dangerous mind, had been extinguished. And here's the question that's eating you up inside. Was it really madness, or was it just excessive lucidity? Because consider this, what if Nietzsche didn't go mad? What if he simply, it saw, did you see, beyond the masks, beyond the lies, beyond the comfortable illusion we call reality? What if he looked into the abyss, that abyss, which he himself had described, and realized that he was the abyss, that there was no separation, that observer and observed were one, that Dionysus and the crucified one were the same thing, that everything was one, and that this one was nothing. And if that realization was so overwhelming, so total, so unbearable, that the only possible response was to switch off. Because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes the truth tells you. Turin, January 1889. A man embraces a horse, and the philosophical world was never the same again but Nietzsche. Nietzsche was no longer here. He had crossed over. He had gone too far. And on the other side, there was no turning back. So what happened to Nietzsche's mind? This is the question that doctors, psychiatrists, neurologists, and historians have been trying to answer for over a century. And the honest answer, nobody knows for sure. There are theories, many theories, some plausible, others absurd, but non-definitive. Because diagnosing a diseased brain in 1889 was basically an educated guess. And today, more than 130 years later, we're just guessing with more data. Let's explore the main hypotheses, and you'll notice something disturbing. Each one of them makes sense, and none of them explains everything. Theory number 1, neurosyphilis. This is the most widely accepted theory, the official one, the one that appears in medical history textbooks. Syphilis was the most feared disease of the 19th century. A silent epidemic, transmitted sexually. It attacked the body in stages. First, sores, then rashes, and then years of silence, decades sometimes. But in the final stage, the tertiary syphilis, it attacks the brain. It causes progressive paralysis, dementia, psychosis, exactly the symptoms that Nietzsche presented. And here's the interesting detail. There are reports that Nietzsche, while still young, frequented brothels. He himself mentions in letters having contracted something in 1866. Some biographers believe it was syphilis. If true, this means the disease whilst asleep it had been in his brain for over 20 years, waiting, corroding, until it finally manifested itself in Turin. But here's the problem. There is no definitive proof. Doctors at the time diagnosed progressive paralysis, but they did not perform the Wassermann test, the test for syphilis, because it was only developed in 1906, 6 years after Nietzsche's death. So we're just assuming, connecting the dots based on vague symptoms and unconfirmed rumors. And you know what's funny? The syphilis theory was popularized precisely by those who wanted to delegitimize Nietzsche. He was mad because he had a venereal disease. He was morally degenerate. Convenient, isn't it? Theory number 2, brain tumor. Some modern neurologists believe that Nietzsche had a meningioma, retroorbital, a benign tumor, but in a critical location behind the right eye. This would explain terrible migraines since I was young. Progressive deterioration of vision, personality changes, the sudden collapse, and there is circumstantial evidence. In 1867, Nietzsche suffered a fall from a horse and hit his chest violently. Some doctors believe this could have triggered the growth of a latent tumor. Brain tumors can cause hallucinations, mood swings, and delusions of grandeur. Everything Nietzsche described, but again, there is no conclusive autopsy. There are no tests. There is no certainty, just sophisticated assumptions. Theory number 3, frontotemporal dementia. This is a more recent theory proposed by 21st century frontotemporal dementia attacks the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain areas responsible for personality, judgment, and social control. People with this condition often exhibit social disinhibition, Nietzsche writing insane letters, euphoria alternating with apathy, his highs and lows in recent months. Progressive loss of empathy, except for sudden emotional outbursts, the horse. And here's the fascinating detail. Unlike Alzheimer's, which erases memories, frontotemporal dementia preserves intelligence for a long time. The person remains brilliant, but loses control. Nietzsche wrote some of his most brilliant works in the years immediately preceding his collapse. Behold, the Manet was written in 1888, months before Turin. And it is a text that is simultaneously brilliant and megalomaniac. Could this be frontotemporal dementia in action? A brilliant mind losing its brakes. Again, perhaps, but we have no way of proving it. Theory number 4, bipolar disorder plus psychosis. Some psychiatrists argue that Nietzsche suffered from severe bipolar disorder, possibly with psychotic features. Look at the patterns. Long periods of deep depression, explosions of creative mania, writing entire books in weeks, extreme social isolation, grand ideas Zarathustra, the transvaluation of values, delusions, the letters signed as deep, and there's more. Bipolar disorder can be aggravated by stress, isolation, and drug use, all the things that Nietzsche experienced intensely. But here's the question: where does the disorder end, and where does the genius begin? Because many of history's greatest artists, writers, and philosophers were bipolar. Van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf. Could bipolar disorder be the answer? Calls Nietzsche's genius, or genius required bipolar disorder. Theory number 5, drug poisoning. Remember the drugs Nietzsche took? Opium, chloro, bromide, quinine. Well, chronic use of these substances can cause a toxic psychosis, irreversible brain damage, especially when combined chaotically without proper medical supervision. It is possible that Nietzsche literally poisoned his own mind string to relieve the pain. The irony would be too poetic, wouldn't it? The philosopher of self-improvement, destroyed by the attempt to overcome physical pain, and now the question no one wants to ask. What if it wasn't any of that? What if Nietzsche hadn't been ill? What if he simply saw too much? Look at what he wrote. Look at where he arrived philosophically. He destroyed God. He dethroned morality. He exposed nihilism as the empty heart of Western civilization. He proposed the total transvaluation of all values. He was too far. And perhaps the human mind wasn't made to withstand that level of lucidity. Perhaps there is a limit, an invisible barrier, and Nietzsche crossed it. On the other side, there was only the void, and the void stared back. So what is the truth? Syphilis, tumor, dementia, bipolar disorder, drugs, or excessive lucidity? The honest answer is probably all together. Because the human mind is not simple. It's not binary. It's not a clean diagnosis on a medical chart. Nietzsche was a physically ill, mentally unstable, emotionally broken, and intellectually insatiable man all at the same time. And in the end, all of this Gumvergein, that square in Turin, that horse, in that final embrace, and Friedrich Nietzsche's mind went out like a candle in a storm. Nietzsche died on August 25th, 1900, but in fact, he died on January 3rd, 1889, the 11 years between those two dates. They were not life. They were a prolonged funeral. After his breakdown in Turin, Nietzsche was admitted to psychiatric clinics. First in Basel, then in Jena. The doctors tried everything. Nothing worked. He was catatonic most of the time. Empty stare, body present, mind absent. Occasionally there were flashes, moments when he seemed to recognize someone, moments when he tried to speak, but the words came out jumbled, disconnected, fragments of thoughts that no longer found form. And then in 1890, his mother, Franziska, took him home to Nuremberg, the city where he was born, where it all began. Franziska cared for him as one cares for a child. She fed him, she bathed him, she dressed him. He obeyed passively, without resisting, without asking. The philosopher who proclaimed "Thwill to power no I" had no desire at all. The man who wrote about Superman could barely be human now. But here's the part that eats you up inside. Was he conscious? The accounts are contradictory. Some visitors said Nietzsche was looking at them with empty eyes, as if no one was there. Others swore they saw flashes of recognition, a fleeting gleam, a slight smile. Imagine, what if Hay was there trapped, locked inside his own mind, conscious but unable to communicate, screaming inside while his body remained silent. It would be the ultimate cruel irony of fate. The philosopher who so valued expression silenced. Have you ever felt that? That feeling of wanting to scream, but nothing comes out, of wanting to move, but your body won't obey. Now imagine living like that for 11 years. Franziska died in 1897, and then the responsibility passed to Elisabeth, the sister. Elisabeth, let's talk about her with the honesty she doesn't deserve. Elisabeth Farster Nietzsche was ambitious, manipulative, and opportunistic. She married a fervent anti-Semite, Bernhard Farster, and attempted to found an Aryan colony in Paraguay. The project failed miserably, but when she returned to Germany and took over Nietzsche's care, she saw Nietzsche was alive, but mentally dead. And that meant she had complete control over his works, over his legacy, over his narrative. And what did she do? He distorted everything. Elisabeth began editing Nietzsche's posthumous writings. She selected passages, she rearranged sentences, she fabricated connections that didn't exist. She compiled the will to power, presenting it as Nietzsche's magnum opus. But it wasn't. They were disconnected fragments, chosen and arranged by her to serve your schedule. And what was the agenda? To align Nietzsche with German nationalism, with everything he hated. Nietzsche, the philosopher who despised nationalism. Nietzsche, who broke with Wagner precisely because of his Nietzsche, who mocked the idea of a superior race. And now he was being used as Bekespersef, these ideas, and he couldn't do anything because he wasn't there anymore. Or could it be that in some hidden corner of his shattered mind, he realized what they were doing to his words, to his life, to his soul. And it was noticeable how that must have been. Elisabeth transformed the house where Nietzsche lived into a kind of sanctuary. Nietzschearch of important people visited, intellectuals, politicians. They looked at Nietzsche as if he were a relic, a museum piece, a silent prophet. He was sitting in a chair, long white hair and mustache, a distant Ghazi drooling occasionally, and people took pictures. They bowed, they commented on his serenity. Serenity as if that were peace, as if that were acceptance. Era absence. August 25th, 1900, Nietzsche dies of pneumonia. Your body finally gives up. After years of resisting, after years of merely existing, he was 55 years old. At the funeral, Elisabeth spoke about the great German philosopher, about his legacy, about his vision, all lies, all distorted, all manipulated, and Nietzsche was buried in the Racken cemetery next to his father, a Lutheran pastor. The same type of religious figure that Nietzsche spent his life criticizing. The irony is so absurd it seems. Roadmap. But here's the final twist. Nietzsche won. Not immediately, not during his lifetime, but later, much later. Her works were rediscovered, reinterpreted, cleansed of the dirt that Elisabeth threw on them. Philosophers, writers, artists, thinkers, they all returned to Nietzsche, and they understood. They finally understood he was right about God, about morality, about nihilism, about everything. He said, "I'm not for now, I'm for later." And he was right about that too. Today, Nietzsche is one of the most widely read, quoted, in influential philosophers in history. His ideas have shaped existentialism, postmodernism, psychology, literature, and art. He changed the world, but he paid the highest possible price. So, what drove Nietzsche to madness? Was it syphilis? Was it the tumor? Was it loneliness? Was it pain? Was it drugs? Or was it simply all? Because maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe that's not the issue, what it drove him crazy. But yes, was it worth it? He sacrificed his sanity for the truth. He sacrificed his happiness for lucidity. He sacrificed his life for philosophy. And today, we are reaping the rewards of that. But what about him? He died insane alone, silenced, manipulated. So, was it worth it? I don't have an answer for that, and neither should you, because perhaps that is precisely Nietzsche's final lesson. Some questions have no answers, only abyss. And you'll choose turn your back and live comfortably in ignorance, or look into the abyss, knowing that it will look back, and when he looks, you will no longer be the same. Nietzsche looked, and the abyss devoured him. Breathe. Empty whiskey bottle. Fill your glass. The next abyss awaits you. Subscribe to the channel